And, well, one thing I'm planning for today, and one thing I did about it to try and assure that it would happen. One, I want to get through the rest of this teaching because I'm going to spend next week beginning to put some things together and get us started in Acts. So I'm going to move us forward no matter what. So to do that, I have 0 notes, 0 additional commentary, spent 0 time going through anything else. So the only thing that is going to come out of this study today is us reading the text and discussing what we want about it. Okay. So let's, because if nothing else, if it seems like we're taking our time in discussion again, I will just read all of the text and we will get through all of it. I believe we are on 48. We only have 2 pages.
Do you have an extra set?
Oh, I have 3 pages, so that'll be lucky to done some. I don't know if I do. I've been on this. Been on this section for so many weeks. I don't even have extra paperwork now.
I have never been cold in this building.
If you'd like to use this, you can.
Cold now.
We are going to be. Oh, look at that. Open almost right to it. So the book goes the other way. You're going to need to flip this way, but we're on chapter 15.
Have you seen this one before? That's not.
Yeah, well, I have not seen this.
So
this one.
All right, so we'll just start. So the paragraph on page 48 at the top, do we have a note somewhere as to where we left off? Did we cover that top page?
We covered the top one.
We're on 18.
Yep, we're on 15, 18.
Okay. All right, Judges 15:18. Then he became very thirsty, and he called to the Lord and said, Thou hast given this great deliverance by the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. So he has been arrested, so to speak, quote unquote, by Jewish people, that his strength will not prevail against other believers, if you will, that the strength of his insights and knowledge and thoughts do not prevail against or mean anything because each individual has their own responsibility. A whole other discussion we could have. But he picks up a jawbone and slays 1,000 Philistines. And one of the connections that was made listening to Grant's teaching is something that we should be mindful of, and probably I should have been prepared to go back and read. But think about the relationship between Samson and God and his slaying of Philistines, and David and God and his slaying of Goliath, one Philistine, let alone others. Samson becomes thirsty and complains, You've given me this great deliverance, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the Philistines? But God split the hollow place that is in the lechi, the jawbone of the donkey, so that water came out of it. When he drank, his strength returned, and he revived. Therefore he named it En-Hakkore, which is in lechi to this day. So he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. I think that verse is as close as we get as Samson being called a judge. It says that he did judging, but of all the other judges listed, he's not referred to as a judge, specifically. Chapter 16, Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. When it was told to the Gazites, saying, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city, and they kept silent all night, saying, Let us wait until the morning light, then we will kill him. Now Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the city gate and the 2 posts, and pulled them up along with the bars. Then he put them on his shoulders and carried them up to the top of the mountain, which is opposite Hebron. What do you think of that?
Very confusing.
That's a lot of weight. You think that's a miraculous intervention? Divine strength and power given to him?
I'm confused. How did he walk past them, steal the gate, and no one noticed? If they were waiting for him all night at the gate of the city, how do you physically steal the gate and no one see you do that?
They would sleep.
Well, it doesn't indicate that they didn't see him do it, and I would rest assured that had they seen him do it, they probably would not have been lying in wait anymore. They probably would have been running.
Right. So
can you imagine a guy coming up to the gate and just ripping them off their hands?
not only hinges, but taking the whole thing with them. Yeah, I probably would leave too.
Yeah, I'm gonna go take that guy on, ain't you?
Yeah.
There's a real danger in this for us to be mindful of. And it's what you could do when God performs a blessing in your life that is required for you to get out of a situation you put yourself in that you had no business being in.
Mhm.
Think about that. God performed this miracle to get him out of a scenario and a situation where he just wanted to go down to a city and sleep with a harlot. He shouldn't have put himself in that position. So what is the danger? The danger is thinking you're justified in your theology. The danger is thinking you're justified in what you wanted for yourself. Because God performed this miraculous wonder while you were doing it.
I actually had that happen now that you've said it that way. I volunteered in my infinite stupidity to pick my ex-husband up from the hospital and take him home. Now this has been 2 years ago, and my son was just, why? Why would you do that? So I actually thought about, right now, why did I really do it? Was I to help Steve, or was I giving myself a pat on the back or trying to eliminate a guilty conscience for something? How very interesting. And the night that all this went down, it didn't end up happening because his wife, they were not legally divorced yet. They were just in the was the only one that could take him out of the hospital. Even his son could not take him out of the hospital.
Oh.
I was absolutely hysterical in the center of my bed, thinking about all this. Why have I done this? Why have I put myself in this position? What kind of message is this giving? Had I just kept my mouth shut, it wouldn't have happened. So it different, but kind of the same. I put myself intentionally in a situation that could not have been anything good. Who knows what would have happened if I got him down to this isolated house in Terre Haute, and he's an alcoholic and he's got liver failure, and what am I doing with this? I got out of it. Why would I put myself back in it? That's really interesting. I always have aha moments here. Huh. Very interesting.
Now, hold on. If Samson's a judge, are we going to talk about the fact that he's sleeping with a harlot? Or is that after his judgely time was done?
What did he just go through?
Well, it said he judged for 20
We
years.
don't think of men as having emotions as much as women. We don't think of men as needing comfort as much as women. But when a man needs comforted and feels that, he'll go to wherever he needs to go to get it. As a man, speaking about a man.
Okay, but does that
And
make
it
it right?
doesn't matter, because if you've ever been under an anointing of that sort where supernatural things are happening and supernatural strength is there, I guarantee you'll go looking for comfort. You'll either do that or completely run to a cave and isolate. Look at your prophets. Look at what happened to them. They were just men, and the Spirit of God came upon them, and they ended up in front of people that they never would have dreamed they would have ended up in front of, saying things that they did not want to hear. And when the Spirit of God left, they were still left to deal with it, still standing in front of those people. And all that supernatural strength and wisdom and all that stuff. And God delivered his message and he just left him standing there. Look how many of them ran and for their lives. Elijah ran for his life.
Jeremiah ran for his life always.
Yes, sir, he did.
80% of it.
Rick,
90%.
what's the real story that's happening? Not just the words. But look at the real story that's happening. And if that happened to you, how would you feel? How would you react? Not one of them reacted the way any Christian in the church would say, well, if that happened to me, I wouldn't have done that. You don't know how you would have reacted, but there was a common thread amongst them all. And how they reacted was that common thread.
Well, one thing that Grant draws out as a point a couple of different times out of his teaching that I think is relevant about Samson is that it isn't until the end that you see him crying out to God through any type of prayer scenario or praying to him. All of his communication, all of his relationship, especially like in this area, is through some form of complaint. And Samson very clearly is a physical, materialistic person.
Personal pride.
By design, by design, he was supposed to be in part, and we're going to talk about the haircut and part of what that means today, believe it or not.
Yeah.
But there is something to be said about, that Nazirite vow still that he was supposed to be adhering to. And again, this is a scenario where he didn't make a choice either. So being able to make the decision to adhere to something that you didn't make the choice to do to begin with is probably pretty difficult in itself. But I think part of the point is, what are you prepared to do? This is how I've been looking at his life. And sometimes we want to only do things based on what we perceive we're going to receive in the future or what the future might hold for us. And sometimes we're not looking just at the here and the now and the work that's been set in front of us with the acknowledgement that we may not be able to see clearly into the future, and just doing the work that's set in front of us now is the point. But Samson doesn't, he doesn't really focus himself on anything other, it seems like, than a joy of dealing with physical things. And while I understand some of the points you were drawing out about the prophets, and I agree with the emotional states of some of them, Jeremiah being referred to as the weeping prophet because he's so emotional, I'm not so sure that Samson's experience would have been the same, specifically because having an innate strength that other people outside of his brethren would be able to clearly see would drive him to want to be there more, and them seeing him pick up gates and seeing him kill 1,000 men and all this stuff would probably be, for most of us, a very difficult challenge and test to overcome when people find joy in seeing us do this. Some of his brothers were going to find joy in seeing him destroy the Philistines. Others are going to be scared of him and running from him. And I think that that would be much easier to handle than someone like Paul or some of the prophets like Jonah, who was sent to go talk to a king and some other things, and their expectation is that they're going to be completely ostracized. No one's going to like them. No one's going to want them around. They have no power to wield over anyone that's going to cause anyone to reflect or react in a certain way. I'm convinced, and I think Samson's kind of the opposite. That's interestingly, I hadn't thought about it, but I'm convinced that the verse, I don't remember where it's at, I don't know if it's Thessalonians or what, but Paul talks about having been given a thorn in the flesh. And something that he's prayed about and asked to leave, and it won't leave. And I'm convinced that what Paul's thorn in the flesh was his inability to share his experiences with God with his fellow brothers and have them believe him. I'm convinced that was his issue. I'm convinced that his issue was he tried to share with fellow Jews who Christ was, his experiences, and they didn't believe him. And because he literally, right before he talks about, having this thorn in the flesh, he talks about he knows a man that went to the third heaven and was caught up and experienced these different things. And then later in that chapter, it's like 20 verses later, he'll then share that God has said, my strength is sufficient for you, or my grace is sufficient for you. And I honestly believe that this is part of the issue because, again, no matter how much strength we have, no matter how valid or strong we think our point is of understanding the scripture, there's two things that defy how wonderful we think our intuitiveness or our insight is. And one, it's the free will of a person who just think you're full of it and not believe it. That's the first thing. And the second is sometimes God doesn't open the eyes and ears. And we aren't going to understand. I'm sure there's areas of things in my life that I'm just not understanding. But one thing that I think God is revealing to us in this particular passage, to be mindful also of what Samson has just done, there's an irony in this. Samson carries the entry point with him when he leaves the city. So by definition, you could almost say that Samson is consciously walking around saying, I am the way, the entry point. And when I was studying years ago, God gave me an insight that I'll never forget, which is in Genesis 6:14, which I did a big study on this verse. It talks about the building of the ark. And in that particular verse, it says that the door of the ark shall be in its side. And the word bitzidah, which means in its side, has a numerical value equal to the words Ben Elohim, which is Son of God. So the word bitzidah, which is the location of the entry point for entering in this vessel of salvation, is equal in numerical value to the word Son of God. So the irony is that as a believer, we are supposed to be carrying around the entry point with us. But who are we drawing attention to? Are we allowing attention to be drawn to ourselves because we're the ones bearing the burden? Or are we allowing the attention to be drawn to the one upon whom we're supposed to be carrying our own burdens and that we're supposed to be drawing people's attention to, right? Isn't that the age-old question for us as a believer?
Right.
You know, what are we doing with that entry point? What are we doing with the gates? And I'm sure I haven't looked them up yet because, like I said, I didn't do any notes, but I'm sure that when time comes and I look up some of these different things, I'm going to find that some of the meanings of these words and some of the place names that are listed here are all given with reason and not just haphazardly. You know, it just so happened this was the closest city, so that's the city he took the gates from or to. I'm sure there's a meaning behind all of that. But he lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the city gates and the two posts and pulled them up along with the bars. Then he put them on his shoulders and carried them up to the top of the mountain, which is opposite Hebron. After this it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, Entice him, and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, how often, I guess the more I do this in these next few weeks, I guess the less I'll have to write and put together and just get us into Acts. But thinking about Samson's life, how often do you reflect on how much you love something or someone in your life, and then also reflect on how much it or they love you? Especially if you're dealing with something you just enjoy doing and being challenged with the idea of giving it up. Samson liked chasing after women. A lot of men do. But it appears to me pretty clearly that these men are different than the first men that approached the first woman that you see Samson talking to, because they were able to intimidate her with death. Delilah doesn't seem to be in that same position. It seems like she might have a greater position, or she might have had some other type of relationship in the town for them to want to try and buy her loyalty. So if she was willing to sell it, which clearly she is, then her loyalties certainly had to have been somewhere else, not with Samson. So what was he really in love with? Was he in love more with his own thinkology, what he wanted, what he liked? Did he truly even know who it was that he was with? And was he perhaps putting expectations on her that were more in lines with what he wanted as opposed to what she was capable of delivering?
Or even his pride and his looks.
I mean, everything you just described there is self-centeredness. It's all about me.
Yeah.
mean, that's just everything you described about Samson. It's all about him, all about what he wanted.
So why do we avoid that so much?
Probably
Real
because it's
strong, but real stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, what did she do? She kept getting his secrets, and then she did the tying up.
Yeah, like,
The
I
ropes and
don't
stuff.
understand how,
Yeah, I read the very first line at the top of page 49, and I'm just,
How long did it take him? How many lessons did he need to find out?
I've always been dumbfounded by
Not on
this.
his side.
It says, so Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength is and how you may be bound to afflict you. Now, that's what the Hebrew says without me looking it up. I'm just dumbfounded, and I have been ever since I read Samson's story, 20, 25 years ago for the first time. I've been amazed to think, what does it take and how do you reach a point where someone asks you what it is that would cause you to be afflicted and you tell them?
happily.
Or you give way, or what is it that causes this? And then how do you even address having a relationship with somebody whose intention clearly is to potentially bring harm into your life?
I think he was so blindedly in love with her that he'd do anything.
You think he was in love with her?
Yeah.
Or the
Well, I think what you said earlier is more accurate. He's more in love with himself. And what he
Yeah,
wants.
I think that's a better description of it.
You
More in
can't
love
do
with
it.
himself.
Yeah, I think that's, what would you call that? Andy said he would think to himself, you can't do that to me, you won't be able to afflict me anyway. What's that called?
Right.
Narcissism, ego, pride?
There's a moral to this story.
So how often, when you really love someone or something, do you stop and reflect on taking away all of the frilly, shiny things around it and reflect on how it feels about you and what it literally would use you for? I mean, this is a very strange way to go into describing this, and it's been a while since I shared this with you guys, but there's a particular commandment in the Torah. I think it's either Deuteronomy chapter 28 or 22 or something, but there's the law of the captive woman. It talks about how if a young man or a man is in war, and it was known, it was understood, and this still happens today, that women will sometimes dress themselves up, put on their nicest clothes, do their hair, whatever else in a time of war, hoping to be taken captive rather than just slaughtered or killed if they're not fighting or if they're not doing something. And so God put parameters around what a man's lust might drive him to do or what his desire might drive him to do. Lust is obviously different than desire. And so God put commandments and instructions that said if he's in the middle of this situation and he sees her and he wants her, then he can take her home to be his wife, but there were parameters around what he had to do. First, he had to put her in her own tent, in her own dwelling place, by herself. He had to shave off her hair. He had to put her in sackcloth and axes, trim her nails so their nails wouldn't be done or attractive in any way, and then had to leave her there for 30 days to mourn the loss of her family. Her mother and father specifically are named and other siblings. And if at the end of that 30-day period, and it's understood both in commentary and traditionally, that if he still wanted to marry her at the end of that 30 days and she wanted to marry him, then they could be married. Otherwise, he was not allowed to sell her. He was not allowed to give her into any kind of captivity or slavery and had to let her go if he no longer desired her at the end of that time period. When I listened to Grant teach that years and years ago, he taught it from a perspective of how often do you stop the habits you have in your life and reflect on them after trimming away all of the beautified processes of them. Like if you really want that car, you really want that brand new house or that brand new car or that brand new whatever it is, God's not looking to try and withhold that from you. But he doesn't want you making rushed decisions and just hurting yourself and hurting somebody else or hurting anything else because you just have to have that now. So you have to trim away and you have to take away all the frilly things on the outside of it and look at it for what it really is and give it an opportunity to sit idly without any responsibilities or requirements over it. And then if you still want it at the end of that time period and it wants you, so to speak, then, right?
Can being stripped of them be considered a blessing?
You can be stripped of what?
all those girls?
Well, it's definitely a blessing to yourself to be
Could it be considered a
self-controlled.
blessing?
It's definitely going to prove to be. I mean, you're going to be choosing to acknowledge a blessing of God to listen to that instruction and walk in it. I mean, if you choose to control yourself and to be self-controlled, that's a fruit of the Spirit. And to choose to look at things for what they actually are, not what you want them to be, not what you think that they should be, but you actually look at them for what they are, then it also helps you to put the right expectations, right? Over things or people or situations.
You've lost out on so much business today.
So it's imperative to keep in mind, right, again, what you feel something strongly about emotionally. Does it feel the same way about you? How is it going to really impact your life? Some things will be much more clear than others. I might love the idea of doing these drugs and hanging out and drinking and partying with friends, but are they even going to remember me in the morning? Are they even going to consider themselves? Is the alcohol looking to do anything beneficial for my life? Are the drugs looking to actually help me get any smarter, or am I just going to be dumber? You know, I mean, to actually be self-reflective and look at, some things are easier than others. This 20th cup of coffee today, is it going to help me? You know? This one little tiny piece of chocolate cake on the plate, although it'll be licked clean here in about 5 minutes, is it really is it healthy? You know?
Yeah.
So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength is and how you may be bound to afflict you." And he entertains having a relationship with her for quite a while after that. And again, I think it is only because of ego and pride and other circumstances that he would even entertain doing that. And Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had been lying in wait in the inner room, and she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the cords as a string of tow snaps when it touches fire, so his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have deceived me and told me lies. Now please tell me how you may be bound." And he said to her, "If they bind me tightly with new ropes which have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man."
Sorry.
Oh, what's up, Steve? Sorry, ma'am.
That's all right. You guys have a good weekend.
You too, Steve. I didn't hear you sneak in, man. Sorry.
That's okay.
So,
So are they married?
it doesn't indicate anything about them having been married. I don't know that he... Yeah, I don't know. I have to read commentary to see if they indicate it for any reason, but
I don't think it works.
Samson marries Delilah and she betrays him. But I don't get the feeling they were married.
Well, so I guess I don't understand how much time maybe has passed between her asking him, telling her, "Bind me with cords," because the way this reads, she's like, "Done." And it's like the next night, she like wraps them up in cords, which I'm assuming is not the next night. Because I would like to think Samson is smarter than that and be like, "Hey, this feels like a conversation we had yesterday."
You would like to think so,
I would like to give him the benefit of the doubt that there was some time.
Maybe not.
I think he was a great, big, strong dummy.
Yeah.
Stupid is.
I've seen a few of them around.
So, I mean, if it really was the next night, you know what I mean? Like, this feels like, man.
And how could somebody so dumb and so egoistic be a man of God?
Because his parents did it for him. He never seemed to choose it. There's no evidence that he ever even mentioned God's name.
Well, it does say that he cried out to the Lord, but I think Dave's point is still valid.
I remember that, yeah.
I think Dave's point is valid, that what he's crying out to is again, being within the confines of something prepared before his birth even. You know, something that was prepared for him to have as a relationship. But the point, there has to come a time when you choose it. You know, you can't just keep living out what your parents built.
Yeah.
At some point, you have to choose for yourself to form, shape, and form what that relationship is going to look like. And we have to enable the children, the young people in our lives to, you know, we have to equip them with the same tools to be able to do that as well.
Yeah. Didn't know I did one.
Carry on.
So so I'm just trying to figure out a difference if there is any. So 7 fresh cords, right? 7 fresh cords that have not been dried. I wonder what the word fresh, I'll have to look this up later, and I wonder what the word fresh and the word new is, and whether or not they're the same word, because in the second time, doesn't he nearly tell her the same,
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's-
new ropes.
Yeah.
right? That have not been used?
Mhm.
Well, maybe they are fresh. Maybe new ropes means newly dried.
Well, it could be. It's a completely different word. There could be a different type of material that was used. One might have been a cord, one might have been a rope. So I'll have to look and find out. Like I said, I didn't do any studying ahead of time because we probably would be sitting here talking about that for the next 3 hours if I had looked this up. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson, for the men." Last time it said she was lying in wait. For the men were lying in wait in the inner room, but he snapped the ropes from his arms like a thread. You know what's interesting to me? His relationship and his desire with her was so strong that he doesn't recognize when she's lying in wait. And maybe, to Tanya's point, I could give him credit for being a little bit dull. But how in the hell do a bunch of men sneak in the inner room and be lying in wait and he not recognize?
Yeah.
You know, that is a little bit different, if it is that way. It doesn't, you know, regardless of how much time may have surpassed in between these events, it's still strange that they would now, like her sin, her issues, is blatantly obvious, you could say. And it was right there on the surface and lying in wait for him. And again, he's ready to jump into it, probably because his ego knew that he lied to her again and that they weren't going to be able to do anything. So Delilah said to Samson, he snapped the ropes from his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Up to now you have deceived me and told me lies. Tell me how you may be bound." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my hair with the web and fasten it with a pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his hair and wove them into the web. And she fastened it with the pin and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he woke from his sleep and pulled out the pin of the loom and the web. Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me?" Think about that statement for a moment. The whole entire problem here, in a way, could be said to be because his heart is completely with her and what he wants from her. That's what the whole problem is. All of his time and attention is focused on what his expectations are from her and what he wants.
He's blinded because of how he feels.
And it's so blind that she's able to say that his heart's not with her. And she becomes this arch enemy to the truth of, "You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is." And it came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. So let's jump ahead for a moment.
See, now that implies some time.
Yes.
See, now I appreciate that he finally gave in.
Adas Abad. New ropes.
Okay, I have to look at it. She says she didn't know where his strength is. To me, this seems to indicate that Samson was so focused on his materialism.
No, he was focused on something else.
Just needed a burr.
Well, he's focused on materialistic things, not just sex, not just her, but everything. Food, relationship, partying, looking like he was the top man, I'm sure. I'm sure part of his ego enjoyed these men. Yeah, I'm sure part of this individual enjoyed these men trying to break in and take him captive and not being able to. I'm sure part of him loved being a more manly man than the rest of the men around and seeing not only Delilah but other men respond this way, or women.
Well, there's some reason why this is in the Bible. This book of Judges.
Where was his strength? You've deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is. This indicates to me that she only knew him as a materialistic thinking individual.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't see him, didn't understand him as a spiritual individual, because at some point in time, she might have been able to pinpoint where his strength was. But she clearly didn't have a vision to see it herself, and she wasn't getting any indication from him.
And she was a Philistine.
Yeah, Philistines, that's what she said.
She wasn't a Jew. She was a Philistine.
She reminds me of the serpent. Very deceiving.
I can't remember what Grant said Delilah means. I'll have to look it up. Lila, if I remember correctly, is the word for night. Hosek is the word for darkness. I think Lila is, I think it's the word for night.
I think you're right. The King James says 7 locks. He said the 7 locks of his hair.
Locks of hair.
7 locks of hair.
Yeah.
So he had them woven. I mean, you wouldn't have had 7 patches. They had to have been woven. If you cut the 7 locks of my hair.
Like dreadlocks. Mm-hmm.
This says Delilah means delicate or weakened.
That's got to be representative.
Yeah, I don't know. What are you looking at, blue letter?
It says in Hebrew or Arabic means delicate or weakened.
I'm not so sure. For me, I have to verify where the source is coming from, because oftentimes Christian sources are not accurate.
I kicked it over to the Inner Concordance, which takes it from the Hebrew, right?
I mean, it may say and it may indicate that it does, but if it's being done by a Christian translator, sometimes they do what they prefer.
I'm just using the blue letter.
Yeah, sometimes I use that, but I never use it as my only source.
The 7 here is Sabah.
Yeah, Sheba is the word for 7. All right, so she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. I think maybe some of us have had that feeling before. So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, "A razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man."
And why does she believe him then? I mean, after telling her 3 times, what made this different?
She kept nagging at him.
Well, that's what made him tell her the truth, but as far as why she believed it, I think she believed it only because it happened, because it worked.
Okay.
So I think if he had lied to her again and she shaved his head and it didn't do anything and he still had strength, then
She would have
just would've-
continued.
Yeah, she just would have asked for the next thing.
Okay,
And I think she would have been willing to receive whatever the next thing was he was willing to give her too.
okay.
So it was a they were in a love-hate relationship with one another, or a hate-hate relationship where it was whatever ego he was willing to share with her and give her, she was willing to accept and
Okay.
expand. So But it does say when Delilah saw that he had told her all that was in his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up once more, for he has told me all that is in his heart." Then the lord of the Philistines came up to her and brought her the money in their hands, and she made him sleep on her knees, and called for a man, and had him shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains, and he was a grinder in the prison. When do you think the Lord left him, and why?
Well, he allowed himself to be deceived through what he wanted, his own lust of the flesh. And then, so God gave him into his desires. By doing that, he also caused affliction on him, and through his affliction, it brought Samson back to God, but it took a lot of pain.
And they humbled him.
Yeah, it humbled him.
So when do you think
Well,
God left him, and why?
so I can't remember what lesson you were teaching us, but you had mentioned something about there are times when you tell the things of God to those who can handle it, and then there are times that you don't. Like there's some people you withhold certain things from. And if this is something that he was supposed to have kept to himself, because like you said, she's a Philistine, so maybe she wasn't supposed to know some of the secrets of the Nazirite vow. Maybe she wasn't supposed to know that. And the fact that he gave some of the knowledge that was to be held for those who should have had the knowledge and who would have done the right thing with it, because clearly she did the wrong thing with that knowledge. So I think the second he told her is actually when it happens. But I don't think he had a need to realize it until it was too late.
It is a hard lesson to learn. It has been for me, and I've had some people argue with me when, or if it may or may not be happening. But the statement, not to cast pearls before swine, can be sometimes relegating yourself or God's word to a discussion where you're sharing it with somebody who just doesn't give a damn and they have no interest.
Yeah.
And she certainly would not have had any respect or would have honored a Nazirite vow from any perspective.
Right.
And I don't know how much that has to do with circumstance, but sharing with her the insight of what it means and what God requires and when an individual wants to take a vow and what Yeshua says about whether or not people should take vows and all these things, sometimes those conversations will be lost on people that are indifferent to them and could care less.
What did it mean to Samson?
That's also part of the answer as to when I think God left him and why. Because that's part of the point too, is why of all people tell her then? So if it is information to be respected, if it is information to honor, if it is a relationship he should have been respecting and honoring more, then what is the point of telling her?
Right.
One of the things I think we can derive for sure from this experience is that Samson at this phase in his life has time and time again chased after what he's seen with his eyes. And this is at least, a third or fourth occasion where he's with a woman because of this circumstance. One of which, as Donna read to us from that book, the one that Dave has too, Samson is indicated as being married to. So it appears to me, at least by the surface of the text, that he has decided to linger and spend time not doing any of the work God prepared for him to do and just spend time with the enemy. And so now he's just amongst where the enemy dwells. Now he's just there in the middle of the camp, enjoying the fruits of what everything else we were talking about earlier that he's experiencing. Whatever food is being brought to him because people might be fearful of who he is. his being able to bring destruction to the Philistines, the stories that would have been shared at this point in time about what he'd already accomplished. The Philistines have been allowing him to dwell within their midst because they've been trying to figure out one way after another to usurp him, unsuccessfully for periods of time. I mean, I don't know how many years might have transpired of his being with Delilah, but if he was literally married to her and living within a camp of Philistines for years, that's a problem.
Right.
That's a real problem. Because obviously the time spent there would have at least rubbed off on him to a point of complacency, where he's just doing what suits himself and not doing the work God would prepare or has already dictated it should be done. Can we not have a problem with ourselves?
Yes.
Can we not reach a place in our faith where we just sit in complacency and we do what makes ourselves happy as opposed to what God has already said should be done?
It's easy to do. You can
Sure
fall
is.
into that real easy.
Guilty.
Yeah, guilty.
If you can't say to yourself guilty, then you need to search yourself.
But the whole tribe of Israel, these 12 tribes, that's the story of their disintegration and separation, and they go to war with each other eventually. All in this book of Judges, so-called Judges. And the book tends to call them prophets. This book does.
So the biggest,
But it refers to, not doesn't call them, but refers to them as the prophets, the quote, early prophets.
I don't know if you guys,
But when did any of them prophesy? Other than Deborah, yeah, there's a few of them that seem to be.
well, Deborah is referred to as a prophet, and those that are considered prophets of God are referred to as prophets. So I don't know, a judge and a prophet are two different things, and they're not intended to be.
Which one of them mentions the Torah? In this book, Joshua, and he was in the days of Moses. He was a young man under Moses.
Yeah.
Chose to lead them as a group, but then they fell apart. This is sort of the story of their falling apart.
Yeah, and
Probably
we
why.
saw at the beginning of Judges that the city, Jericho, that had been conquered by Joshua was lost. And the city had returned back in the hands of the enemy in the time of Judges, and there was an issue with that. So they had fallen so far from the observance, and I think that's what the text says, that they had fallen so far from the observance of God's Torah that they lost cities that had been conquered. They lost territory that they had gained, that they had won because they gave up their relationship with God's instruction.
But as we read forward, we're going to get to the point where God reveals himself to the Philistines who are not.
Yeah, so we are going to get to the
It's a
conclusion
twofold
of Samson. Yeah, Samson's life, the conclusion of it will bring about some of the ways of rekindling or rebuilding that relationship, so to speak, with God. But let me say real quick, I don't know how much you guys recall of Numbers chapter 6, I believe, is a chapter that has a Nazirite vow, but Grant had made a statement that I think is relevant for us understanding, and that's that when a Nazirite vow comes to an end, you recall one of the first things is that you do? And if you remember, Paul, who was, and this is, I can't tell you how important it is to understand this. Paul was being accused regularly in the New Testament, and many, many, many Christians today still accuse Paul of doing away with the Torah and doing away with God's commandments and being the one who is teaching that we don't need to observe these things. We don't need to do them. Just be a Gentile, come in, have faith in Christ, and don't worry about doing any of these commandments. Paul is accused of this regularly. And when he comes to Jerusalem at one point in the book of Acts, the disciples say to him, we are hearing all these rumors that you are going around teaching people not to keep God's commandments or the traditions of men. In other words, the traditions of the fathers that have been handed down over time in conjunction with the commandments. And they say, we're hearing this, but the evidence of what you're doing speaks louder than the rumors, and the evidence is showing that that's not what you're teaching. And they tell him this in Jerusalem. The evidence is many people are being brought to faith in the Lord. Many people are having a relationship with Christ. and they're still going to the synagogue, and they're still enjoying these holidays, they're still enjoying the festivals. I'm paraphrasing the idea. But the evidence was clear that Paul was helping Gentiles come into the faith, but at the same time he was not teaching to do away with these things. And so what do they say? So that all the people can see that you have been under a vow to God to teach the Gentiles, but not do away with the things of God. Go to Jerusalem, go to the temple, and pay for these 3 men over here that took a Nazirite vow. Pay for their cost into the temple to have their vow come to an end and to have their head shaved.
Is that in Acts 15?
I don't remember what chapter it's in, but it's in Acts. And so Paul goes to Jerusalem and he pays the expense of the temple tax for the men to have their vow brought to an end. He pays for the sacrifice. They all make a sacrifice in the temple, and their Nazirite vow comes to an end, which means they dedicated their lives, and this is evidence of this, that they had dedicated their lives to God. Now the shaving of their heads, physically, the shaving of Samson's head, physically, and part of the reason why God, and this is one of the insights that Grant drew out, is that when God gives a command not to shave the hair and not to trim it during the time they turn to the Nazirite vow, it is that actually what happens is the head is shaved at the time you take the vow. And then the hair begins to grow. And all the hair that is grown, which obviously for this to take place in Samson's life, he wasn't even born yet, right? So hair began to grow while he was in the womb and when he came into the world. But all the hair that grows is the sign of the length of time, so to speak, in the physical, of that dedication to God. And so the head is shaved in the beginning of the vow, and then at the end of the vow, the head is shaved.
And so signs like that were important to the Hebrews.
But the problem,
They were taught to make sure that the signs were.
the sign was important, I think, to God for other people to see it. That
Yeah.
people had made this determination. But the problem lies in our thinking that the sign is evidence of our strength or power. And the men who had their heads shaved with Paul, or Samson who had his shaved,
That's why Samson.
have the issue of having to come to terms with, are you still dedicated to God? Are you going to fulfill now? You know, like if you abstain or absolve yourself of eating something or taking a vow, interestingly, the process of Lent, the time of keeping yourself from eating certain things. I've heard other Christian denominations that take this practice, making vows of certain things. Just because you absolve or just because you refrain from doing something for a period of time doesn't absolve you of still walking and or still having the same vow of relationship with God before or after it. And the men in particular that Paul took to the temple were not suddenly absolved of having to walk in the things that God instructed or having a relationship with him. And Samson, finally, I think this is what Samson has to learn. This is finally what Samson comes to terms with, is that even though you were willing to bring about the end of your vow to me by telling her that your head could be shaved and you would bring about the end of your Nazirite vow, I think that Samson had to realize that his problem was when he was lusting after with his eyes, and when he finally lost the ability to lust through that physically, he literally loses the ability to lust through those eyes and chase after what he wants. He finally came to terms with his power and his strength, and the source of that was in God himself. It wasn't in your hair or in the vow God made. It was in the interest that God showed in being about your life.
That's important.
Because if you remember, that's what it said in the beginning, is that his parents did not know that God was about it. Samson had a desire and a lust after a woman in particular. It didn't absolve him of having to change whether or not he chased after it. But God decided to be about his life and decided to be about that circumstance and use it for something that would be good.
Sure, there's a lot of things that's of great interest to us. But to God, he has a way of knowing without those signs and things that we do. Like, see, I I don't have my crosses on. If I had my crosses on, I would be a visual display for you. For you. For you. For me.
I don't,
But not to God. God knows what's in my heart and in my mind.
I don't think that the strength or the source of Samson's strength was in his hair. But the very next line, verse 22, this is at the top of page 50. The very next line says, however, this is after his head got shaved, however, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. This is a reminder to us that even though things can be cut off by your words, by your actions, by your choices to turn away from God, it doesn't mean that God's not still about his own business. It doesn't mean that you're not still his business.
Amen.
God is still about the things of him and his kingdom. Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice, for they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands. I don't know if you know, but Dagon was a fish god. It was like a male, I think it was a male persona that had like a fish body from the waist down or something. Like a male version of a...
Like a mermaid.
like a merman, I guess. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us. It so happened when they were in high spirits, and they said, call for Samson that he may amuse us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he entertained them, and they made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. And now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women were on the roof, looking on while Samson was amusing them. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me just this time. O God, that I may be at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested and raised himself against them, the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Then his brothers and all his father's household came down, took him, brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. Thus he judged Israel 20 years. 20 years elapsed, and that's 4 chapters of information about Samson's life. So I guess if we want to know how much time there was.
He found out where his strength was, and they found out they couldn't chain God down.
Yeah.
I gotta go.
All right, my man. Have a good day.
Yeah, 4.
Yeah, we'll be here at 4 for fellowship if anybody wants to come in. Otherwise, I'll have dinner somewhere between 5:30, I'm guessing.
What time do you want me here to help you?
All I'm going to do is clean up a few things here, figure out what I need, go to a store and shop. I mean, if you want to